Welcome to the Visible Policing Podcast, where we explore the nature and impact of the visual in relation to contemporary crime and policing.
My name's Liam Ralph, Research Fellow at Northumbria University, and I'm delighted to be joined by photographer and documentary filmmaker John Faulkner. So John Faulkner is currently making a documentary film about our project and will be capturing visible policing as we go along. So John, just to start off with, do you want to tell me what got you into the business?
Well, I guess I did very badly during my A-levels. I got really, really bad results, and part of the reason for that was I spent all my time in the school darkroom. So I, instead of going to lessons, I went to the locksmith and forged a key for the school darkroom, so I could go in any time. And I guess what I'm talking about is what got me into photography first, rather than talking about what got me into the business. So I think the two, it's probably quite good to describe this kind of first bit a little bit. So I was very interested in being creative and creating kind of visual imagery, but I was really, really poor at drawing and art, and I couldn't paint. I still can't paint. I always really wanted to, but there was something very magical about the process of photography and developing films in a darkroom, which you don't do anymore, which I think is a bit of a shame.
So that process is really interesting for you then. It's the process that you enjoyed to start off with.
Completely, yes. I mean, it's a bizarre process. You take this bit of material and you add chemicals to it, and then you create these images that come up by adding chemicals. It's absolutely fascinating.
And is that what you would have done then? Is that what? Yeah.
Yes. It's really funny talking to you actually, because I have to describe to you what film is.
Yeah. Absolutely, yeah.
So how old are you, Lim?
I'm 27.
27, and you've never experienced that process.
But it's something that you will have. Do you still do, or is it something that?
I don't have the time to do it now. I'd like to get back to doing it. It's a much more, I think, meditative kind of way of producing images. And whilst everyone's producing images all the day, all the time through their mobile phones, there's more photography and visual images than ever. But there's a lots of ubiquitous kind of volume of images. So I don't think we actually look at pictures properly as well.
So what do you mean by that then? We don't look at pictures properly? I
think because we produce so many of them. I think that's one of the issues now, is that we're surrounded and absolutely bombarded through visual imagery for very astute reasons. It's for reasons of marketing, advertising, all sorts of kind of ways, and we will, through social media, see one of the successes of Facebook was less about the comments but more about the pictures that people were able to share, and that's what kind of really for social media has been a very powerful thing. But we consume hundreds and hundreds of thousands of images, but I don't think we look at them properly or slow down. The process is too quick now.
What would that do then if we did slow down, or what are we missing? Is probably the question.
I think we're not encouraged to look at something properly. So we everything is given a very kind of cursory kind of glance, I guess, and we miss the detail. And David Hockney, the famous artist from Yorkshire. Do you know David Hockney?
I don't know.
Oh, go and have a look at David Hockney. It's really interesting. But he talks about one of the issues being with digital technology being that it's too quick, so it doesn't stop and look at what's really is happening. So when we kind of look at the world, we're kind of looking for kind of perfect stylized imagery, which it just misses everything.
And what do you mean it misses everything then? As in,
I think there's a lot of information. So if we take, for example, looking at some of the work I've started doing for you on the filming the police stations, we can start looking at very close in detail of those police stations, and from that, those smaller, more detailed images can then open up a whole way of questioning about that structure or that building that you're looking at in this kind of project, really.
What kind of things, I mean, just because you touched on the work you're doing for the project, what sort of things are you looking for then when you have been out and you have been capturing some of these stations?
I think we don't know what we're going to come across when we come to these police stations. And working with the other filmmaker, Jim Newick, who's incredibly experienced in and passionate about looking at the built urban environment, we can try to look at those, we can cast a glance or a gaze upon those buildings in a way that perhaps you wouldn't look at, and by producing footage that then draws attention to those details. So it might make you think about that building in a different way that you hadn't previously done so. So, for instance, we might film the building in its entirety, the whole building, but actually the really interesting stuff might be little details in locks or handles or bits of graffiti that make you. And I think those sorts of things get you to slow down.
And are these things that we'd be quite easy to walk past and maybe perhaps wouldn't stop? And
completely,
yeah.
So I think when we started working with your team, Jim took you on a walk through Newcastle to look at some of the kind of modernist kind of structures that were there, to leading you down to the police station in Pilgrim Street. So, and when you were taking your photographs, I noticed you, Liam, you went to photograph the details of the building, particularly. So some of the photographers were kind of moving out quite far to sort of, and then you were looking at the details. So that was obviously, you were drawn to that for a specific reason.
Yeah, I don't know what took me to the detail. Yeah, I think there was just, I think it was the graffiti, as you said. It was just, I think when we spoke about it as part of, and you described how that building is made from.
It's Portland stone. Portland stone is the kind of. It's the high-end stone that comes from. I think it's. I might get this wrong. It's either the Isle of Wight or the Isle of Man, but it's very expensive. It's there to denote this is a very important kind of building or structure, or it shows wealth as well.
Okay, yeah,
it's very important. But I think also in that detail, it can sometimes conjure emotional kind of feelings as well. So you at some level you want people to, I think, respond emotionally to an image, be it through a moving image or a still image. So if you look, perhaps let's say you have the detail that you photograph that handle, maybe you start thinking about the people that have got in and out through that door, what's happened, the journey of people travelling through that door. Maybe that's a slightly esoteric kind of a thing to think, but you start those are the things that you can kind of start to think about. Or did people wait there whilst they were going in to report a crime? What was going through their head when they went through that door?
So it sounds like slowing things down and really spending time at these kind of scenes and trying to really take it all in and try and understand what exactly is going on is important then. And from what you were saying before about how we're bombarded now with photographs, we're a bit kind of more intimate perhaps with our mobile phones. We take photo after photo, but we don't actually stop to look at the detail. So Absolutely. That's exactly what you're doing there then. You slow it down, you try and work out how long people spend, you're saying, when going into the building, coming out of the building.
We're trying to imagine their interaction with the building and the sort of things that they're going to. I'm in this room today looking at clips on the side of this table for some reason. I don't know. It's.
Do you find you get drawn to these details then? If you kind of when you're at these stations, but also say you come into the university building here just now, are you drawn to these kind of little details then? Actually,
I think it's in the mundane and the overlooks where all the stuff that's really interesting.
And do you think that makes a good photographer then? Somebody who is interested in these minuscule details? And
I think it makes an interesting photographer. A good photographer, I don't know. I want to make my work interesting, and particularly so. I photograph nature a lot as well. So I might go to the woods, and I'm not looking at great panoramas. I'm looking at tiny details of leaves or the veins on the back of leaves, or again stuff that I think you kind of would walk past and not consider. You're looking for the, I don't know, you like going walking, Liam, and you go to the Munros?
Munros, yeah.
So your picture, I don't know, your picture of the Munro might have a grand vista of all those kind of peaks and maybe a picture of a lock at the bottom of the picture and in all its kind of grandeur, which is fantastic and it looks amazing, but there's so much more to it than it's in those things.
I read an article recently and I've taken it in with me just now, and it was, I think I shared it with you before as well, so it was the photographer Kirsty Mackay, and she was talking about Glasgow and how she's doing this project just now in Glasgow. She's taken photos of some of the deprived parts, so where we really see inequality. And for her it was kind of, she's got this quote where she says she wanted to take photos of not just the people but the people that have been kind of left behind for her in these kind of areas. But it made me think, what purpose do you see photography kind of playing today?
So I think when I went to university to do my photography degree, I was very much of the idea that you could use photography to change ideas and perceptions. I think I've changed that a little bit now, but I was very interested in terms of if we take looking at poverty as one example. One of the ideas is that if you show poverty, then people might respond to that and work and make efforts to try and alleviate that poverty. If people don't know about it, then they can't kind of help that situation. So I always believe that was a very kind of powerful thing. But one of the other potential issues with that is that you can get into something that's, again, and because there's so much photography, people then don't respond to it. We're kind of bombarded with those kind of images. So you can end up with something called poverty porn, where people are kind of drawn to seeing images of people in very desperate situations, but there's no reaction, or they might just look at them and not respond, which can be problematic because then you're showing the people in those photographs as victims, and they're not giving any power or kind of control of that situation. So I think a very common, again, you were around, but in the 80s, did the Ethiopian famine, and there was it was sort of big jump up, sit up moment. These pictures were coming back very quickly from the famine in Ethiopia, some really distressing kind of footage. Now, those pictures have been around before. There have been other famines before that particular one, but I think because there was perhaps a increase in the advantages in technology, so those images came back a lot quicker, and there was big response to it. We had Live Aid and Do They Know It's Christmas, like charity #1 signal. But those images were of obviously starving children, and the idea was that you would respond and give money. That was the focus of those images. Now, it's really important that we knew that a famine was going on, but there's a further question to ask about whether for those people that are in those photographs, if we just present them purely as victims, then for themselves as individuals, that's all they're ever viewed as. So going back to this thing about kind of what was the name again? Kirsty
Mackay.
Mackay. I think it is really powerful, but you have to do it in a really sensitive way, a way that doesn't victimise people. Shows them to be quite proud still, perhaps in some of those situations. It's really important to create that kind of imagery. I mean, historically, what the Victorians used to do, this is quite fascinating, is that they used to go into very poor areas of poverty, into the Victorian slums. And the wealthy would go in and they would take photographs of these poor people, and then they would have dinner parties in the evening and have these sort of magic lantern shows, and everyone would sit down and look at the pictures of the poor people. So it was a very degrading kind of process in a sense. But there must have been a shift eventually for that kind of work to be seen as a tool to try and help people in those situations. So I think it's a complex process.
And is there a recognition amongst photographers that try and prevent and avoid that, trying to stop?
I think there's been a change. I think people, and again, I think naively when I first started photography, I thought I wanted to go into these areas and photograph people, and then they would get published and it would change and people's perception would change, but the reality was, unless those photographs go to people who can make those decisions to alleviate those poverty, it doesn't really, people might disagree with me about this, I'm sure, but I question about how much they will change. And that's a Guardian article you're reading?
Let's have a look. I think, The Guardian.
Okay,
it was.
So I read The Guardian a lot. I think I generally support its views, but I would say, so for example, people who read The Guardian, myself included, we generally already know that those things are pretty difficult. So,
And do you think it can be quite dangerous then if you do have that outlook when I'm going to go in, take photos and leave again?
Yeah, I think you have to be really careful and think very carefully about why you're doing it. Who's it for? Is it for the kind of ego of the photographer, possibly, or is it really to genuinely help those people that you're going into to kind of photograph? And how can you just go into those areas and understand their lives really? I think that can be problematic.
And what do you think that entails then? What does that require to really kind of go in and understand, and if you are going to take photos? And
Okay, so if we were to take in Newcastle, we have the fantastic Side Collective photography gallery down at the Quayside. I don't know if you've been down before, Liam. You must go. I'm pointing my finger at Liam now.
Yeah, I will go.
Okay, so they were much. So there's a very famous piece of work that came out of some of the early work from the Side Collective by a Finnish photographer called Sirka, and she lived in Baika for a long time, and she photographed the community there before that area was demolished and the Baika wall was built. So she kind of captured a bit of time in Baika of that community. So they're very much was that you don't parachute photographers in to kind of take photographs, but you kind of immerse yourself in those kind of areas. I think there's still a problematic nature to that sometimes.
Does it kind of fit into, I mean, you talked about power before. Can power be two-way when you're taking photos? So it's not kind of the photographer going in, taking photos, deciding what to capture, what not to capture, but can people themselves involved, can they have a sense of power in determining what's captured and not captured? And is that two-way? Do they have a
Well, I was always really interested. I mean, one of the areas of photography that I got into very quickly was portraits. And I was taught by one of my lecturers here, actually, Northumbria University, where I graduated from. It's really nice to be back here today, by the way. Was that, the portrait's a two-way process, so you're engaging with that person in a very different way. So you're looking for their input into producing that photograph and that picture. You don't just go and take the picture and go. It's about talking to them, understanding what they're, getting to know them a little bit.
And is that something you would do then when you're taking photos yourself? Then,
yeah. Very much. So I wanted to be, I think the early stages I wanted to be like what I call a sexy street photographer, like just travelling the world with a camera around my neck, just observing the world, and thought that was really cool.
Can that be uncomfortable as well as a photographer if you're if it is two-way? Does it mean surrendering some of your kind of, not skills, but your knowledge in terms of what you want to do and how you want to do things, and actually kind of relaxing some of those, not ego, maybe your ego, but and just kind of
I think that's a good observation. Yeah, you are. I think you are surrendering your ego a little bit in doing that. Producing better pictures, I think.
Yeah, and why do you think they're better then? Because it's two-way. Because
you're attempting to make a connection with that person, which as a street photographer, you kind of not. You don't do that really. You observe things very quickly, and then take your picture.
Do photographers look at each other differently then, in terms of, are there different kind of outlooks, approaches that they would take?
Photographers, talking about photographers, that's a funny. I think we've all got our different approaches. I think that sometimes can be quite an ego-driven sort of profession. You're potentially in a position of power, so I think for some photographers, they kind of enjoy that element of being in power and being in control, and some of the famous portrait photographers like David Bailey, or somebody just died recently, Terry O'Neill, and he's photographed the Queen and all sorts of people. If they're interviewed, they would talk very much about them being able to sort of control these sort of celebrities or very, very famous people.
So control as in they decide what they look like. And
I think trying to I think David Bailey spoke about trying to photograph Jack Nicholson once, and said it was quite a long process because Jack Nicholson was such a big personality, and it took quite a while, and he ended up using a really big camera to kind of like to kind of get on top of Jack Nicholson in a sense, and his sort of really big personality.
So he needed the big camera.
Yeah, so he got something called a big 5.4 camera,
and that only served the purpose of.
It served the purpose of slowing it down and getting sort of like literally physically imposing himself upon Jack Nicholson.
I never thought about these power imbalances between the photographer and the person who's they're trying to take photos of at the end of the day, and how that can exist.
Yeah.
When we think about policing,
yes,
how does that transfer across then? How does that relate to, because some of the things Bruce said, we're going to be looking at buildings, the visual objects, the police uniform, the ceremonial uniform. and also this kind of social media. How do you think that transfers across then for you? Are there any kind of considerations that, based on your experiences of being a photographer, that you then have to think, or you've already thought about?
I think because you have a project that is, so you have an academic. This is an academic research project. So you're a social scientist, and you're looking at something very specific. That, for outside of the academic community, this is not a straightforward idea that you're trying to convey. So I'm hoping, and we will in the work that we're going to do with you, we're going to look at stuff, and going back to that detail, we can perhaps see detail that you may not realise its significance, and we might see those little bit pieces as things that can make this project accessible to people outside of the academic community. And maybe we want to try and reveal. I think it's about revealing these quite complex observations that you're making. One of the things that really turned me onto photography quite quickly was an exhibition by the Magnum photographers, and I was down at the South Bank. It was probably about 19, and had my first camera, and I was photographing skateboarders. It's a famous part of London, the South Bank, where they used to have lots of skateboarders, and it was the 60s. It was sort of built in the 50s and the 60s, sort of modernist structures. Prince Charles famously talks about it as being a carbuncle, and sort of that made a mess of London. But it's a beautiful. I think it's an amazing bit of London. Anyway, there was a retrospective of a group of photographers called the Magnum photographers. And Liam, do you know about the Magnum photographers?
I don't know. I'm not doing very well at your Q&As today, John. You have to give me a list of things to do.
I'm going to send you off to go and have a look. So I was really drawn to their work. They're a sort of co-op of photographers, some of the world's best, most amazing photographers, from Cartier-Bresson, Robert Capa, and recently they've accepted Martin Parr into their ranks as well. But so they would be around on the sort of really, from amazing street photography by Cartier-Bresson, who talks about something called the decisive moment, to photographers like Robert Capa, who was there at the D-Day landings, and it's just amazing photography. And I'd never seen photography like that. I didn't really understand how powerful.
How was it so powerful then? What made it so powerful?
I think I'd never seen photography like that before, and there was I didn't know you could do that with photographs. Didn't know you could create images in such a way that would just so that you could respond to so powerfully. And I was right, that was 19 at the time, and I've reassessed that in a sense now, and I go back and look at some of those images, and those questions about ego, power and control come into it now.
And when you look at them now, how does it compare to when you looked at them when you were 19 then?
Oh, I couldn't compare it. It was just one of those light bulb moments where you see something and go, I want to do this. I really want to do this.
And when you look at these photos, do you still kind of have that same? Does it still have that same effect on you then when you look at these same photos?
No, it doesn't. No, but because I've made it my profession now, and it's a different response. So I might look more critically at them in some respects, but they are just really powerful.
Yeah, so those images, to an extent, got you into photography,
yes.
And then, you looking at it now, you said you'd be quite critical. Then you would,
not quite critical, but I would look at it I would look at it in a different way now.
And in what kind of way would you look at it now? Then, what would you?
I guess I would look at some of the work. I think in terms of the discussion that we've had here so far, question the, I suppose the efficacy of some of that work. And because there's a lot of what you find in documentary photography and photojournalism, there's lots of photography of poverty, and we don't see. What's really interesting, we see far less photography of wealth and control, and there's good reasons for that. So there's people who have wealth and have control, are much more guarded and have much more power to have for there not to be people coming to look at them or observe them. So it's really interesting that when we had the 2009 financial crash, I suspect. I mean, something actually must go back and have a look at. I wonder how much photography was there of bankers, or these people that had caused this crisis.
So yeah, I mean, you described it before as, I think it was like, was it poverty porn?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think visually, it's an easier area to get access to.
I think you described before
Yeah.
the Victorian example where
Yeah.
it was to return to your own estate to examine these photos that have been taken of the other side,
Yeah.
so to speak. Yeah.
But it doesn't. It's not a two. But it doesn't happen the other way around.
Yeah. Okay.
So the banking crisis, it was there were individuals' response, whose behaviour as bankers caused a worldwide economic crash. People lost their homes, people lost their jobs because of it, and yet, those people, okay, let's not get into a massive social debate here, but they caused some of that inequality. But we can't go visually. Can we then go back and photograph those people?
Yeah, in those moments.
Do we get? We can't get access to the chief exec of Morgan Stanley, or I'm just trying to think of those big American banks.
Does that go back to power then and inequality?
Yes.
And as you said, you just cannot get access to take photos of those moments. So, and is that about power then? Whereas what we can take photos of is perhaps some of the inequality is much easier to photograph.
Yes. Yeah, it's easier to get access to. It's very simple. And those people that are in those positions of inequality have very little power to say no.
Is that a danger for photography going forward, or has it always been a danger and it's just going to continue to be a danger? Or is it something that photographers can kind of pay attention to and actually try and address?
I think it's just sad. It's just a fact, I think, of how it is. But I think it's for photographers to have a responsibility to be aware of if they're going into those areas. There was a quote by the journalist Owen Jones, and he said it was really interesting that he's the journalist who wrote one of his books was called Chavs and the Demonisation of the Working Class, and he said that we have Poverty Street, which is one of these programs. I think Channel 5 has lots of these programs. We have something called Poverty Street, but we don't have Bankers Street, for example. So it's
what does that tell you then? How do you respond to that?
It tells us about who has control, doesn't it?
Yeah, and it seems like it's almost like a lens to look at people and how the other half kind of live.
Yeah, completely.
Is the way it's kind of approached. And
there was a dreadful one I saw recently with people with bailiffs going into houses. I mean, why is that an interest as a TV program? I mean, it's just dreadful.
I mean, they talk about dark tourism and going to tourist sites that are dark and cynical past. I mean, does that kind of fit into the same dark photography and dark filmmaking and dark?
Completely.
I thought it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on Instagram and Facebook. You talked before about being bombarded with images and so on. What role do you see social media as playing? How do you see social media now? If you could have said that people are it sounded like they're much more intimate with their phones and they will just take snap, photo. They don't really stop to look at perhaps the detail, but it's just about getting 50 photos and picking the best one, the perfect image, and getting it on their accounts. How do you approach social media, and what's your thoughts on Facebook and Instagram and what that's doing to photography? And
well, there's two ways of looking at it. So you could say that it's fantastic for photography. There's people producing images. I mean, that's really great. But what you want to see is stuff being different, and that's the problem. Is that all the photography starts to look quite similar, and that people be copying stuff. They might take their image because they think, this might work well on Instagram, instead of saying, well, actually, I'm just going to take this photograph because I'm really interested in photographing it. So people are trying to second guess how that picture may be responded to, so they might want to have lots of likes, they want to have people commenting on it. It kind of misses the point, which is just about producing the photograph. Is it an interesting picture? Does it work?
I mean, the final kind of bit that we're just to finish on with the Visible Policing Project, what do you really hope to capture with the Visible Policing Project? What do you really want to get?
I want to create a story for you. So I want to help people engage with your research by creating a visual narrative, creating imagery that's potentially quite powerful that will draw them into this story. Good filmmaking looks effortless, so you should watch it and have no doubt as to what the film's about, what it's trying to tell you. As a viewer, you shouldn't have to struggle to understand what you're seeing. But behind that is a lot of complexity, and a lot of that complexity is about the structure of the film, trying to balance you talking about the research and what you've discovered, which might be very complex, and create that into an old-fashioned story with a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I think we really respond well to stories. That's how we receive those things really well. So documentary films, the really good ones are really good stories. They're really good storytellers. So great documentary filmmakers tell really, really good stories. It's much harder in a sense than a normal fictional kind of blockbuster film, because that's created and written and structured. In a fictional piece of work, that's much more straightforward in creating the structure. But with a documentary film, because you don't know what's there, you don't know which elements that you have to build that story. So it's a bit like, I've said this before, maybe a bit of a trite comment, but you're trying to DJ at a nightclub, and you've got your box of records, and you're trying to mix all those records together so that creates a really lovely kind of flow of music that you're going to really respond to. But we don't know what that music is yet, or how we're going to put it together, and we have to just do it.
Or how your audience is going to respond, and you might need to change the tapes and so on. I think when I talked to you before, you kind of said that's perhaps some of the interesting things about this project, is because you don't know how it's going to look like, and that's the difference for a documentary film. We don't know what we're going to capture or what people's perceptions and narratives, and I guess that's the whole reason why we're doing the research, is to kind of see how it's understood both within the police, by communities, by citizens, and so on. So that's the interesting part to an extent, and for you it's about trying to film that along the way then, and that journey, and then trying to end up something that looks effortless, but certainly there was a lot of kind of thought that has went into it throughout the process.
And we don't want to create a cliche either. That's the other thing that's quite hard. So making something accessible without being a cliche is very difficult.
What does a cliche look like then? What do you mean by a cliche?
If the work looks too familiar, or it comes to conclusions that perhaps you could, as a viewer, you could predict what's going to happen. So for instance, we had this chat. So we went to Blackpool to film the Bonny Street police station. We're in Blackpool, and there's all of the seaside resort stuff going on, and that part of the filming could very easily turn into a film about Blackpool and candy floss and trams and
bright lights,
exactly. But it's not about that. It's about this police station that is situated in Blackpool, and actually the bits that were interesting about the Blackpool trip were its position behind the seafront, and it's sitting on an area of deprivation. Actually, that was quite interesting, that this building that was supposed to create safety has now disappeared, and now it's become an area of poverty. There is no safety there. There are no policemen, visible there. I don't know. The project isn't about Bobby's on the beat, but that was quite an interesting sort of way of thinking about it.
Yes, it goes back to what you were kind of saying. So you could be, if you entered Blackpool, you could perhaps be drawn to the bright lights, perhaps be drawn to these kind of shiny things, the candy floss, as you said it before. But actually, for you, it's trying to get perhaps the things that we're not drawn to, but we perhaps should be and should be focusing on, and that parts of the police station that perhaps you would walk past because you would instantly be looking at the tower in Blackpool. But actually, if we just turn our head to the right and see the police station, then there's also these other things going on.
Completely, and I think that's why I'm hoping why we can do some interesting work for the projects, is that we're going to look beyond those cliches, I think.
Fantastic, that's great. Well, thanks very much, John, for joining us today for the Visible Policing podcast.
Thank you very much, I really enjoyed that.
This podcast is produced as part of an Economic and Social Research Council funded study, Visible Policing. For more information, visit visiblepolicing.com.